Consider the doctrine of eternal security. The term sounds much like a foreign language to many, and I will tell you more, but first you should know it is not true. Eternal security is a false doctrine. Eternal security is marketed as a guaranteed ticket to heaven, so many think that a holder of the ticket may sin and feel secured against hell, and they think of themselves as once saved, always saved. Now some may ask, saved from what? The thought is to be saved from an eternal punishment in hell. As once saved, always saved, they cannot lose their ticket to heaven, so their security is guaranteed and eternal. Several biblical passages seem to support eternal security. For example, consider a paraphrase of John 10:26 through 28. My sheep believe and follow me, and I give my sheep eternal life, so they shall never perish, neither shall any man pluck them out of my hand. Then John 10:29 describes the sovereignty of God. The sovereignty of God means that God is greater than everything else. My Father, which gave them me, is greater than all, and no man is able to pluck them out of my Father's hand. However, some may use the pluck me not verse to tie God's hands. They argue that God is sovereign, but not sovereign in every situation. For example, a person may no longer believe, so what then? Luke 8:13 states that some do believe for a while and then quit. So may God put them down? He holds me not. Either way, God is sovereign. It is God's decision. So when it comes to biblical support for once saved, always saved, God's sovereignty is a circular argument. No biblical verse says, once a believer, always a believer. Even Luke 8:13 states that some believe for a while and then quit. And Jesus said, my sheep believe and follow me. So there is still a requirement to believe. So where are the biblical verses that teach God sets a person down? Are there any biblical verses that literally say God does that? Absolutely, there are. But first, consider who wrote and taught God sets a person down, because not all of the apostles of Jesus had a hand in writing the New Testament, and who wrote it plays a role in our argument. Simon Peter called Cephas, and Andrew, then the brothers James of Zebedee and John of Zebedee, and then Philip and Bartholomew, 6 here. Thomas, Matthew called Levi, James of Alphaeus, Thaddeus called Jude and Simon the Zealot, then Judas Iscariot, and 6 more here. Then God transforms a zealot named Saul into the Apostle Paul, and he writes 14 of the 27 New Testament books. Then these 7 men wrote the 13 other New Testament books. Matthew called Levi, James of Zebedee, Luke the physician, John of Zebedee, Simon Peter called Cephas, and Thaddeus called Jude, and a John Mark who is not even an apostle. So 8 men made use of the Greek language and wrote the New Testament. And here we begin to see why knowing our apostles is important for our argument. because only one of these 8 men wrote the Greek word Adokimos, and he wrote Adokimos in 8 verses. The 8 Adokimos verses prove that eternal security is not true, and the man that wrote every one of the 8 Adokimos verses is the Apostle Paul. So let us look at all 8 verses and why these prove eternal security is not true. 2 Corinthians 13:5 is our first example of the Apostle Paul's use of Adokimos. Examine yourselves whether you are in the faith. Prove your own selves. Know you not your own selves, how that Jesus Christ is in you, except you be reprobates. Here the Greek word adokimos is translated reprobates. Adokimos, noun. Here the Apostle Paul begins to define what it means to be an adokimos person. The Apostle Paul wrote that an adokimos person is not in the faith, and secondly, Christ is not in an adokimos person. 2 Corinthians 13:6 is our second example of the Apostle Paul's use of adokimos. But I trust that you shall know that we are not reprobates. Here is the original Greek text of 2 Corinthians 13:6. The arrow below shows the Greek word adokimos. Then 2 Corinthians 13:7 and 2 Timothy 3:8 and Titus 1:16 show the third, the fourth, and the fifth uses of the Greek word adokimos. The translation is reprobate. So consider our 5 introductory examples of the Apostle Paul's use of adokimos. Each of these verses show the Greek word adokimos to mean reprobate. Now 3 adokimos verses remain. Here is the 6th example of the Apostle Paul's use of the Greek word adokimos. But that which bears thorns and briars is rejected, and is nigh unto cursing, whose end is to be burned. Hebrews 6:8. And here is the original Greek text of Hebrews 6:8. The arrow below shows the Greek word adokimos. You do not see the translation reprobate written here. Here the translation changes, and another word replaces reprobate. Now our 6th verse shows the Greek word adokimos to mean rejected. Who gave the translators permission to write rejected in place of reprobate? The Apostle Paul continued to write and use the Greek word adokimos, and there is no change in the Apostle Paul's ancient manuscripts. So who gave them permission? But who gave them permission begs another question. What difference sets Hebrews 6:8 apart from the other adokimos verses? What bothered the translators? Earlier, the Apostle Paul began to define what it means to be an adokimos person. The Apostle Paul wrote that an adokimos person is not in the faith, and secondly, Christ is not in an adokimos person. And Hebrews 6:8 gives the same definition as the Apostle Paul's earlier definitions. Here, the Apostle Paul adds that an adokimos person bears thorns and briars, and he or she is nigh unto the end curse of God, to be burned in eternal fire. However, there is one difference in the Hebrews 6:8 Adokimos verse. Here the Apostle Paul wrote that a number of Christians fell away from the faith, and these fallen Christians are now Adokimos persons. But King James and his translators were defenders of the doctrine of eternal security, and as Christians, they thought of themselves as once saved, always saved. They believed that eternal security is a guaranteed ticket to heaven, and as once saved, always saved, they cannot lose their ticket to heaven, and whoever holds the ticket may sin and feel secured against hell. So the Apostle Paul's doctrine bothered King James and his translators, and in response, they changed Adokimos to mean rejected and not reprobate. Now, all English-speaking peoples would instead read the word rejected. They would disassociate a fallen Christian from the word reprobate, and they would lose the connection to the other reprobate verses. King James and his translators were defenders of the doctrine of eternal security, and as Christians, they thought of themselves as once saved, always saved. Do you recall 2 Corinthians 13:6 and the Apostle Paul's use of Adokimos? But I trust that you shall know that we are not reprobates. As long as the Apostle Paul wrote that he is not an Adokimos person, King James and his translators allowed the translation reprobate. But when the Apostle Paul wrote something different about himself, King James and his translators made other changes to Adokimos. 1 Corinthians 9:27 is our seventh example of the Apostle Paul's use of Adokimos. But I keep under my body and bring it into subjection, lest that by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. Here is the original Greek text of 1 Corinthians 9:27. The arrow below shows the Greek word Adokimos. You do not see the translation reprobate written here. Here the translation changes, and another word replaces reprobate. Now, our seventh verse shows the Greek word Adokimos to mean castaway. Earlier, the Apostle Paul wrote that a number of Christians fell away from the faith, and these fallen Christians are now Adokimos persons. And the Apostle Paul's doctrine bothered King James and his translators. So in response, they changed Adokimos to mean rejected and not reprobate. But then the Apostle Paul wrote that he himself could fall away from the faith, and that he himself could then become an Adokimos person. Again, the Apostle Paul's doctrine bothered King James and his translators. So in response, they changed Adokimos to mean castaway and not reprobate. As long as the Apostle Paul wrote that he is not an Adokimos person, King James and his translators allowed the translation reprobate. But when the Apostle Paul wrote that he could become an Adokimos person, King James and his translators changed Adokimos to mean castaway. The Apostle Paul wrote that he is not an Adokimos person, but he wrote that if he did not bring down and keep his body in subjection, then he could become an Adokimos person. Who gave the translators permission to change the meaning of Adokimos and write rejected and write castaway in the place of reprobate? None of the other apostles made an attempt at defining Adokimos. None of them even used the Greek word Adokimos. Only the Apostle Paul. If you believe that the Bible is the divinely inspired Word of God, then you also believe that God never does anything by accident. The other apostles never made an attempt at defining Adokimos. They all knew God assigned Adokimos to the Apostle Paul. It was his alone to define. The other apostles dare not touch the Greek word Adokimos. So is King James greater than the apostles? So why would King James usurp the authority of the Apostle Paul? Do you wonder? Consider Acts 9:15 and God's statement of the Apostle Paul's authority. The Apostle Paul is a chosen vessel unto me to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. Then consider Romans 11:13 and the Apostle Paul's authority in his own words. For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify mine office. God gave the Apostle Paul authority greater than Gentile kings. So the Apostle Paul boasts of his office and of his authority in apostolic office. Mine office is magnified, and the meaning of a word is mine to decide. So the other apostles dare not touch the Greek word Adokimos. However, King James decided to usurp the authority of the Apostle Paul, take and occupy an apostolic office, and redefine the meaning of Adokimos. So who gave King James permission? Not God. But the proof against eternal security is not difficult to understand. If the Apostle Paul is able to become an Adokimos person, then eternal security cannot be true. And there is no truth in the doctrine of once saved, always saved. So, some believe for a while and then quit. And God calls them Adokimos and puts them down. An Adokimos person is nigh unto the end curse of God, to be burned in eternal fire. Hell is a consequence of sin. So consider the behavior of all of the king's servants, his emissaries, agents, soldiers, and subjects, whomever. Few to none of the servants of King James would obey his orders if they believed a Christian could sin and become an Adokimos person, and if they believed God would place them to burn in eternal fire. And the Catholic popes share the same fear as King James. The consequence of sin is hell, and few to none would obey orders if they believed God would place them to burn in eternal fire. So, the Catholic popes issue indulgences to remove the consequence of hell, and King James changed the translation of the Greek word Adokimos, and that even the Apostle Paul could himself become an Adokimos person. Indulgences and eternal security are marketed as guaranteed tickets to heaven. Whoever holds either ticket is permitted to sin and feels secured against hell. And both groups think of themselves as once saved, always saved. Political and religious leaders repeatedly attempt to argue there are no consequences in store for those that serve our governments or that adhere to and embrace our secular laws. But the Apostle Paul wrote that he himself could fall away from the faith and that he could then become an Adokimos person to be burned in eternal fire.